What if protecting nature meant erasing a way of life? What if the effort to preserve forests silenced the very people who have protected them for generations? This is the ethical dilemma we explore today. In many parts of the world, including Malaysia and Indonesia, indigenous people live in rich biodiversity zones. They make up just 5% of global population, but manage over 80% of the world's biodiversity. Governments often introduce conservation projects like national parks or carbon offset schemes aiming to protect the environment. But these projects are sometimes implemented without consulting the indigenous communities whose land is being used, violating their right to free, prior, and informed consent, as required under the UN RIP. In 2022, reports from Rainforest Foundation Norway found that in Southeast Asia, indigenous groups were excluded from over 60% of new forest conservation plans, despite occupying those areas for generations. This means the forest is being saved, but the people are being pushed aside, displaced, or silenced. These communities have deep cultural, spiritual, and ecological ties to the land. Losing access can mean losing identity, livelihood, and ancestral memory. This raises urgent questions. Can we call it ethical to protect nature while violating indigenous rights? Does environmental justice mean anything without social justice? And who decides what's the best for the land? Those who govern it, or those who have called it home for centuries? This is not just a policy issue. It's a story of power, silence, and responsibility. In this video, we examine how a well-intentioned conservation project may have harmful consequences and what ethical frameworks can guide us toward better decisions. I'm Anita, and I'll now pass it to Shanthini, who will explore the case study analysis on this issue.
In this section, I'll be analyzing the ethical dilemmas involved in the government conservation proposal on indigenous land, one made without proper consultation. We'll explore two ethical frameworks, campaign ethics and utilitarianism, to understand how ethical principles guide decision-making in this case. This case involves three key ethical dilemmas. First, the project was proposed without free, prior, and informed consent from the indigenous communities. This violates their autonomy and their right to self-determination. Second, while environmental protection is important, it's being prioritized over indigenous land rights, a classic case of competing moral values. And third, the land in question holds deep cultural and spiritual meaning. Disruption could lead to irreversible cultural loss, which isn't just a material issue, it's a human rights issue. According to Kantian ethics, people must be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means to an end. In this case, the government has a duty to consult the indigenous people, not just as a policy requirement, but as a moral obligation. Disregarding their input violates their autonomy and treats them as obstacles to be managed, not as equal moral agents. Kant's principle of universality also applies. If it's morally acceptable to ignore consultation once, it sets a precedent that justifies the marginalization of vulnerable groups everywhere, something we would find unacceptable if reversed. Utilitarianism asks us to consider which action brings the greatest good for the greatest number. On one hand, the conservation project could protect biodiversity and ecosystems. That's a public benefit. But on the other hand, the harm caused to indigenous communities, including displacement and cultural destruction, could outweigh those benefits. And some harms, like the loss of ancestral ties, can't be reversed or fully compensated. So from a utilitarian lens, if the net harm is greater than the benefit, then the project is unethical. Both Kantian ethics and utilitarianism suggest that failing to consult indigenous communities is ethically problematic. Whether it's a matter of duty or harm, the clear implication is that indigenous voices must be at the center of the decision-making process. In the next section, Cash will take this further by applying the tools from the ethical decision-making framework to evaluate the situation more deeply.
Main steps towards ethical decision-making. The ethical decision-making process involves four steps. First, to recognize the issue and establish facts. The government plans a conservation project on indigenous land without consultation, violating their rights under the principle of free, prior and informed consent, affecting their livelihood and culture, though the project supports sustainable development. Second, identify relevant parties and policies. They are the indigenous community, government bodies such as Department of Orang Asli Development, JAKWA, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Sustainability, state government, non-governmental organization or civil society organization, and key policies that were identified are United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Federal Constitution, the Aboriginal Peoples Act 1954 and JAPA Strategic Plan. Third, develop potential actions. There are two potential actions that were identified in this case. Either conduct consultations with the indigenous community or proceed without consultation. Fourth, conduct tests. There are four tests as follows. Harm test assesses which option causes less harm. Professional test checks legal and policy support for the decision. Faith test for religion perspective on decision. And publicity test for morality of a decision by considering its transparency and social acceptance. The harm test is a comparison between two options for conducting or not conducting consultations with indigenous communities regarding the project that affects their livelihood, identity, and socio-economic stability. It highlights the benefits and drawbacks of each option for both the indigenous community in terms of livelihood preservation, cultural retention, and sustainability, and the federal or state government in terms of transparency, cost optimization, and public trust. Conducting consultation is shown to promote community well-being, spiritual values and trust, while avoiding consultation risks socio-economic harm, cultural loss, and diminished public confidence. Hence, conducting consultation has benefits that outweigh the risks of not conducting consultation. For the professional test, the key legal frameworks and strategic plans protecting indigenous rights in Malaysia includes the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which guarantees their spiritual and traditional relationship with their lands and resources. This is a treaty under the United Nations. The Federal Constitution, specifically Article 85C, allows for special provisions for the protection and advancement of Aboriginal people. The Aboriginal Peoples Act 1954 defines Aboriginal areas and reserves, while the Jaqua Strategic Plan 2023 to 2026 focuses on safeguarding land culture and traditional leadership of the Orang Asli community. Next, I pass to Vanessa for the detailed explanation on the faith test and publicity test.
What would religion say about excluding indigenous communities from land conservation decisions? Across the world's major religious traditions, we find shared values such as respect for life, justice, compassion, and care for the earth. These principles strongly support the need to consult indigenous communities, not just as political or legal obligations, but as a moral imperative. In Islam, two key values are adl, justice, and amanah, trust or stewardship. The Quran calls for shura or consultation in decision making. Ignoring the voices of indigenous people who have long protected and lived in harmony with these lands violates both justice and trust. Christianity teaches us to love your neighbor as yourself and to serve as stewards of God's creation. A conservation plan that causes harm or silences vulnerable communities goes against the call to love, protect, and uplift the marginalized. In Buddhism, the principles of karuna, compassion, and ahimsa, non-harming, are central. Disregarding ancestral connections and displacing communities would cause suffering and thus violate these foundational teachings. Hinduism teaches dharma, our moral duty, not just to each other, but also to the environment. Any actions that exploit the land or disrespect those who are spiritually and historically connected to it fails to uphold this duty. Indigenous spiritual traditions often view land as sacred and alive. To exclude these communities from decisions about the land is to ignore not only their rights, but also their sacred relationship with nature. Whether through the lens of Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, or indigenous belief systems, one truth stands out. Respect, justice, and inclusion are not optional. They are sacred responsibilities. Engaging with Indigenous communities is not only ethically sound, but spiritually essential. The government proceeds with a conservation project without consulting Indigenous communities, public perception may be harsh. Firstly, it may be seen as unjust and colonial, echoing past injustices where Indigenous communities' voices were silenced. Secondly, it can be seen as environmental hypocrisy, claiming to protect nature while harming those who have preserved it. Lastly, it also can be seen as politically and ethically damaging, especially if Malaysia violates UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or its own constitution. But if meaningful consultation takes place, it reflects good governance, transparency, and respect for rights. The story would highlight Malaysia's commitment to social and environmental justice. And public criticism turns into public support or commendation. Only the path of consultation passes the publicity test. It's the one choice we can defend, both morally and publicly. As we've explored throughout this video, ethical decision-making is not simply about choosing between the right and wrong. It requires us to engage with complex, often competing values and to make space for perspectives that are too often excluded. This case forces us to reflect deeply on how ethical issues in sustainability and governance are layered and intersectional. At first glance, the government's intention to conserve land might seem purely positive, an environmental good. But when viewed ethically, we begin to see how even well-intentioned actions can carry moral harm when they are silenced or when they exclude the very communities most connected to the land. This experience reminded us that ethical decision-making must go beyond ticking policy boxes. It must ask who is affected, whose voices are being heard, and whose voices are being ignored. Using tools like harm, faith, professional, and publicity tests help break down those questions into clear steps. But more importantly, it showed us that good ethical practice means centering dignity, justice, and truth, not just results. To conclude, our group tackled all three types of ethical questions that are normative, conceptual, and factual questions. And this gave us a more well-rounded analysis. From the lens of normative, we asked, should the government consult Indigenous communities before conservation projects? From the lens of conceptual, what does true consultation mean? Is simply informing enough, or is full, free, prior, informed consent required? From the lens of factual, how many Indigenous people are affected, and what does the law like UNDRIP actually say? By engaging with these layers, we weren't just solving a dilemma, we were using holistic ethical reasoning. And our conclusion? Ethical action must be guided by both values and facts. This process sharpened our moral clarity and critical thinking and reminded us that justice and sustainability cannot exist without inclusion. Thank you.